There has been a debate that has started in the African American community in the United States regarding whether or not Black Americans are the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel and are, in fact, the original Jews. There's also some discussion as to whether or not Black people in America, in their identity as God's chosen people, has been the victim of identity theft. I want to address these issues as I go throughout the community. I hear a lot of discussion, a lot of people asking questions and talking on this subject and this issue, and I hear opinions all over the place. This is something that I've devoted a considerable amount of study and time to in the past. This is a subject that I've discussed and studied with Dr. Yosef Ben Yochanan, who was born a so-called Falasha, a Black Jew from Ethiopia. He was a professor at Cornell University, but he also served as a professor at the University Al-Azhar in Cairo, Egypt. And he's probably considered an authority on this subject. And one of the things that's critical, I think, is for us to gain an understanding of this issue based on the actual evidence and not based on emotion or conspiracy theory or things that that have no actual basis in fact. Let's start out with this issue about whether or not Black Americans are the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. First of all, let's go back and look at the 12 tribes of Israel. Reportedly, the first Jew would be Abraham. And Abraham's grandson, Jacob, gave birth to 12 sons from 2 wives and 2 concubines. And these are the 12 tribes that are the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So this is the origin of this group of people. And the earliest dates that we can go back to is in the 19th to 20th century BC, to look at, this is when the first Jews actually came into existence. But we can go back and see that the very first dynasty in ancient Egypt is reported to have begun in 3100 BC, more than 1,000 years before the birth of the first Jew. In addition to that, you can go back even further in the pre-dynastic period, and we see that the civilization of ancient Egypt started in the south and came up from a Sudanic complex of civilizations, sometimes called Kush, sometimes called Nubia, but there was a whole culture of building pyramids and other stone structures, and that predated pyramid building in ancient Egypt. And what we find is that there is a well-established record that Africa was populated prior to ancient Egypt. So what we have is a large body of Black people, Africans, dispersed actually throughout Africa. And there's a substantial body of evidence to support that Africans were, in Africa prior to the birth of the very first Jew. So when the Jews enter the history, there's already a well-established African community dispersed throughout Africa. And actually, Africans dispersed in other parts of the world by this time as well. And I think there's a substantial record of that as well, in terms of particularly in the so-called Middle Eastern area. And so without going into all of the, it in great detail, to believe that the Black Americans are the 12 tribes of the children of Israel, the descendants of, we would have to exclude all the other Black people in Africa that existed and had descendants prior to the Jews coming. So it really is not a logical proposition. It doesn't make common sense to say that the Black people in America are the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. There's no actual evidence to support it. Now, there is evidence to support that some Black people in America may be descendants of the 12 tribes of the ancient Hebrews, because we can go back and we'll find that if you look at the history of Israel, established its kingdom around the 10th century BC with King Saul. And then his successor was King David. And then Israel reached its height of cultural achievement under King Solomon. And after King Solomon, Israel went into civil war. And when it went into civil war, it broke into two separate kingdoms, which consisted of Israel in the northern section of the land of Canaan with 10 tribes, and Judah, the kingdom of Judah, in the south of Israel with 2 tribes. There were 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the southern kingdom, which was Judah. And shortly after that, there were waves of invasions of superior powers that came through. For example, the Assyrians came through and devastated Israel and took the 10 tribes captive and ultimately took control of Judah as well. So the Syrians' invasion resulted in the disbursement and scattering of the Hebrews, the Jewish nation. They got scattered throughout other parts of the region as a result of the Assyrian invasion. Next came the Babylonian invasion under King Nebuchadnezzar. And the Jews were once again that remained were taken captive. And then ultimately you have the Persian invasion. And of course, the Persians will ultimately allow the Jews to go back and begin to restore Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. But and there's actually 2 additional temple building periods reported in the Bible. But what happened is when this when Jews began to return to the land of Canaan or land of Palestine or their homeland, their alleged homeland, then all the Jews did not return. Only a remnant, a small amount. Many found lives in other places and settled in other places. They mixed in with other groups of people. And this became the pattern all the way up until the time of Christ. And by this time, many Jews had been what's called Hellenized. They became part of Greek culture and Greek society. And then the Romans took over, and the Romans eventually destroyed the temple of Jerusalem again in 70 AD. And the Jews were then once again dispersed, many dispersed into various communities in the region. And then the historical record after that, from the 1st century up to around the 11th century, is really a record of the dispersion of Jews, or dispersing of Jews. And you have groups of Jews who are Black, who appear as far as South Africa and other parts of Africa, who practice traditional Jewish culture, wear traditional Jewish garb, and use the Torah and practice Jewish rituals, and in essence, a transplant of the Jewish culture into various parts of Africa. But you also have a similar thing that's taken place in other parts of the world, such as in Khazaria, which is the kingdom of Khazaria was a group of whites who lived near the Caucasus Mountains in Europe. And this kingdom actually adopted Judaism as the state religion and avoided becoming immersed in the conflict between Christians and Muslims during the Crusades. So the Khazarians adopted the religion of Judaism, and they were converted because there were waves of Hebrews, of Jews that had dispersed and traveled there and settled there, and they had a profound influence on civilizing this empire of people and bringing them into the religion of Judaism. And so, not only was there a acceptance of the religion of Judaism, but there was also an amalgamation of the people, of mixing together and intermarrying. And so when the Jews who were from Khazaria migrated into Poland and Germany and began to settle there, many of these individuals were from Khazaria, and they were very fair-skinned individuals that would pass for white. And so during Hitler's Germany, Hitler actually raised the issue about the Jews and blamed them for the loss in World War I, and condemned their usury practices and high interest and all those things. And he set out a plan of ethnic cleansing to remove the Jews and kill them off. So he set up concentration camps and death camps, and is reported to have exterminated some 6 million Jews on the basis that he claimed they were bastardizing the Aryan race because they were a mixed race group of people, and they contaminated the racial purity of the Aryan race, and that this racial purity resulted in the Aryans, the German people, losing the First World War. And so in terms of looking at this history and how it has unfolded, what is happening now is you have about 7.6 million by the last estimate, I think, of census of Jews who live in the United States. Many have dual citizenships with Israel, and you have another 7 million in Israel, and another 1.3 worldwide. It's reported that all combined, there's about 15.3 million Jews scattered around the world. A large percentage of those Jews are considered Ashkenazi Jews. They're Jews that are, in essence, European Jews. And in many cultures, like in the United States, they've identified as being white Jews. And so in terms of looking at the issue that we see unfolding in the United States is the issue of whether or not the white Jews were involved in the slave trade, whether they owned slave ships, and then also there's questions about their business practices now in terms of in the music industry, the music distribution, and in the entertainment industry and in other related industries. And it is claimed that these individuals dominate these industries and treat Blacks unfairly. And so there's been criticism against them that have been actually done as sweeping generalizations that don't condemn the individuals involved in the unfair behavior, but condemn, in essence, all Jews in a blanket type statement, a sweeping generalization. Much like Blacks have experienced, where a few Black people commit a crime, and then white supremacists say that Blacks are all criminals because a few Black people committed crime. So this is kind of a similar situation that is happening in terms of those in the Black community who are being called anti-Semites because of the position that they take against the things that have been committed by some Jews. And so I think that we need to understand it in its context and begin to be able to look at how we address these issues. Because if you look at the Jewish community, those who identify as white Jews, they are subject to persecution from white supremacists as well, because in the eyes of the white supremacist community, they don't view the white Jews as being white. They view them as being Jews and being of mixed race. And so because of this, like, for example, at the Charlottesville incident a few years ago, when the lady was killed there, when the protests took place against the Confederate monuments, and then there were white supremacists that opposed it, and it ended up in the murder of a lady. And the crowd, the white supremacist crowd, chanted, "Jews will not replace us." And this same chant has been made in numerous rallies around the country, and particularly even associated with Donald Trump. And so this theme of Jews will not replace us is a targeting of white Jews in this country. And so in terms of the experience of persecution from white supremacists that Jews have, as well as Black people have, where we've had murders take place in Black churches by white supremacists. There have been white supremacy attacks throughout the Black community. And so we live in a climate now where we really need to understand the real facts. The reality is that the designation of God's chosen people, if you actually study the biblical record and look at both the Old and New Testaments, what you'll find is that the seed of Abraham is identified in the New Testament as not as seeds, but as a seed, the seed of Abraham. That's how the earth would be blessed, and that was through Jesus Christ was identified as the seed of Abraham. If you look historically, the record is very clear that the 12 tribes of the children of Israel constantly violated the covenant that was established between Moses, God, and the 12 tribes. And because they kept violating it, the record is very clear that the status of being chosen is, in essence, non-existent. And if you look in the book of Romans, for example, it says that the people that are of the flesh, they're not the people of God. So in other words, that your genealogy has nothing to do with your being chosen of God. The being chosen of God is a result of a spiritual condition, and that is when you have embraced and accepted the teachings of Jesus Christ, and that you manifest love for your brothers, and that you obey the commandments that were given through Christ, which is that you love God and you love your brother, and that all the other commandments are fulfilled in those two. So in terms of looking at the issue of whether there is a God's chosen people at all, I think the record shows, if we're using the Bible as a basis, and that's where the concept is arising from of God's chosen people, I think that it clearly is showing us that there is no group of people that, on the basis of flesh, on the basis of genealogy, are considered God's chosen people, whether they're Black Jews or white Jews or anyone else. And so I think that this is an important study for us to take a look at and to examine. And I think it's important for us to recognize that the escalation of this conflict based upon misinformation, it may serve the interest of some, but in reality, it's destructive overall to the Black community. And we need to actually study and gain a clear understanding of the facts.